Hi. My name is Cinnamon Roll, and I'm building a school bus into my home. Winter was firmly upon me, and work slowed down considerably, but I was able to get some stuff done. I'd also like to celebrate that we passed 50 subscribers as of the recording of this voiceover. I know it might not seem like a lot, but any kind of growth is a good thing, and I'm grateful for all your support. In last week's video, I made this gauge cluster panel, and it was time to finish up the details. First, I removed the last of the protective plastic. And then using some superglue, I installed these warning light stickers. There was still some superglue residue left from my previous failed attempt to make the gauge cluster, and so I had to remove that first. I used a light under the panel to make sure that the holes would line up with the warning lights, and then I glued the warning light surround to the panel. Once that was done, I used some spring clamps to keep everything from moving and to apply pressure. After that, I installed all the gauges. Now that the gauge cluster was done, it was time to install it. I started with the dash surround, and once that was all bolted in, I installed the gauge panel. And here's what it looked like all put together. And I think it looks alright. It's not perfect, and I might build another one in the future with what I know now, but for now this will work perfectly fine. When I was recording this video, it was right around February of 2025, and it was a cold, snowy winter that seemed to go on forever. That said, there were some days that were above freezing, and the sun came out a few times, which warmed the bus up considerably. This allowed me to be able to do a little more seam sealing. Now, I don't think I ever explained what seam sealing is for, or how I do it, but it's pretty simple. The idea is to fill any gaps in between the joints of the metal to stop any water that may get past. For this particular application on the inside, I wasn't overly concerned with how it looked, because this will be behind insulation anyways, so I made sure to smear it on good and thick. Next, I decided to start work on the main entrance door. I decided to build it inside the bus because there was very little chance of a fire spreading from any kind of metalwork I might have done, and also because I needed the space. That said, I didn't want to work on the floor, so I built myself a quick and dirty sawhorse out of a couple of skids and some 2x4s. These were the original bifolding doors of the bus. I wanted to keep a little bit of the bus's original identity, so I decided to repurpose these. The idea was to take these two doors and combine them into one. The problem I ran into is that these were very heavy, and moving them around was a bit of a chore, so to make things easier on myself, I bought an electric winch and installed it on the ceiling of the bus. The first thing I had to do with these doors was strip them down of any extra parts that I didn't need. There was a locking mechanism, there were pivot points, and some pieces of aluminum that were holding the rubber trim. And you know, it's funny, it always amazes me how I continued to find things as it worked on this bus. This time, it was a peanut. I found this in the cavity where the locking mechanism was housed. How it got there, I have no clue, but it was an amusing find either way. Once I had everything taken off the doors, I had to lay them out to the dimensions that I wanted. Once I confirmed that the doors were square and that they were where I wanted them to be, I laid down these pieces of bed frame. I then sanded the paint off around where the bed frame was going to be, clamped them in place, and welded the frames in. This was to tie the two doors together to become one. Now, because the floors of the bus are going to be insulated and this door would sit on top of the floor, I had to reduce the height of the door in order to make it fit. I used a grinder to cut off the bottom of the doors using the bed frame that I installed earlier as a guide. And because the door was originally hollow, I had to flip it over again and cut from the other side as well. Next, I made up some metal plates to cap off the top of the door. Now, sometimes I get into a bit of a get her done kind of mood, and sometimes I forget that I need to film what I'm working on, so the angle for this particular part of the build isn't all that great. Next, I needed to add an apron to the bottom of the door. This apron would sit on the outside of the bus, whereas the main body of the door would sit on top of the floor. It's kinda hard to explain, but you'll see when it's done. So for this project, I almost entirely used leftover scrap materials from other projects. This here was the bumper from an old camper that I cut down and happened to be the same thickness of the metal that was originally on the door. Now, in the process of cutting out the apron, it did get a little bit hot, and so I had to straighten it out as best as I could. I then cleaned it up with the grinder and welded it into place. Now that the apron was installed, it was time to fill that giant gaping hole in the center of the door. I used the same material that I used for the apron. I test fitted it to make sure that it would work. And then I cleaned off all the rust to get it ready to be welded in. After that, I used the grinder to clean off the paint from around where the filler piece was going to be welded in. And then I began the long process of welding it in. Now at first I tacked it into place, and then I came back and welded the entire seam. Any of you who have any experience with metal fabrication probably can see the issue here, but I'll show you that later. I don't know what it is about me and welding, but I have a bad habit of catching things on fire. This time I set my arm on fire. Luckily I was fine. A ruined coat and sweater were the extent of the damages. Once all the welding was done, I did the first pass of the grinder to take the tops off all the welds. I then ran the sander over everything with 80 grit sandpaper. Now that the front facade of the door was more or less complete, I flipped the door and focused my attention on the back. My plan for this door was to insulate parts of it, but to do that I needed to make the door thicker. First, I strengthened up some of the welds on the back side of the filler piece and filled some holes. It was at this point where I began to notice my mistake. The door was very heavily warped from all the welding I did. To be quite honest with you, I'm surprised the glass didn't break. My first attempt to straighten the door was to put in another central brace. As you can imagine, this really didn't do a whole lot. So I had the top and bottom frames in place, but I hadn't done the sides yet. So I once again cannibalized the camper bumper to make some flat pieces of steel. So I was beginning to realize that I'd really managed to screw up this door quite badly, but I was already weeks into this project and didn't want to give up so easily, so I kept on trucking. What I should have done is stopped, reevaluated, and maybe started over from the beginning, because at this point I was just making things worse. But this is a classic case of the sunk cost fallacy. So this is a cognitive bias that describes the tendency of individuals to continue investing time, money, or effort into a decision or endeavor because they have already invested significant resources into it, even when the current costs outweigh the benefits. Once I cleaned most of the rust off the edge piece, I clamped it in place and welded it in. This, I was hoping, would also take some of the bend out of the door, but to no avail. Regardless, I kept on going and did the same process for the other side. I decided to cover up the bottom two windows, but the top two I wanted to be able to see out of, so I had to frame around them. The metal I used for this actually came from a treadmill that I bought for another project months ago. It, too, turned out to be the same thickness as the metal in the door, so it seemed like it would work out perfectly. Now I didn't have long enough pieces to go all the way around the windows, unfortunately, so I had to do these window frames in 2 pieces each. The stuff was easy enough to work with, and to make those bends all I did was score a line with the grinder, and then I used a square edge to bend the metal over. I made 4 pieces of metal like this, so 2 pieces per window. I welded them in, and I was satisfied with the results. Now that I had the frame completed, I once again flipped the door over and cleaned up the areas around the edge pieces so that I could weld the seams. I spent around 6 hours on the welding alone for this door, which further made me want to see this project through to completion. For those of you who may be in construction, the height on this door was going to be 83 inches. That is much higher than what your standard household door might be, but you have to remember that right after this door is a set of stairs. Now, if you grew up taking the bus to school, and you're on the taller side, you may remember the days of bunking your head on the door frame as you stepped out of the school bus. That's why the door is taller. Once everything was welded, I went over everything with the grinder. This was another one of those jobs that took a long time, and I think I did something like 3 or 4 passes before I was satisfied with the results. I then flipped the door over and did the same thing on the back side, followed by a pass with the sander with 80 grit sandpaper. And then I attempted to get the apron just a little bit more flat. My next goal was to paint and insulate this door, but the inside of the bus was too cold for that, so I needed to move it into the heated barn. Now this presented a challenge. The door at this point was already excessively heavy, and I had to come up with a solution for how to move it without giving myself an aneurysm. So I strapped the door to my rolling chair. It looks stupid, but it worked, so I guess it wasn't really that stupid. Now, obviously I couldn't use a chair outside the bus, so I resorted to just dragging it along the ground. And as you can imagine, because I dragged it through the snow, and because it was fairly dirty, I used a shop vac to clean out all the dirt and snow. And once that was done, I wiped everything down with a damp cloth. So because you weren't going to be able to see through the bottom glass anyways, I decided to paint the backside black. Now obviously glass is very shiny, and paint doesn't like to stick to shiny surfaces, so I had to rough up the glass with sandpaper. And then a quick pass with the shop vac, followed by a wipe down with a shop towel. This is matte black Rust-Oleum paint. It's nothing special, it's just there to stop rust, and in my case, to paint the window black. The next day I came back and removed the masking that I did the day before. Then I started with the insulation. This is 1-inch foam, just your standard rigid pink stuff. It has an R value of about 5, which isn't much, but it's better than nothing. I laid the foam flat on the door and tamped it down to make an outline so that I knew where to cut. There was a deeper section in the center of the door which I needed to fill as well. Now, I did have spray foam, but I wanted to use it as little as possible because I had a lot of this 1-inch foam and wanted to use it at first. Once I made sure that everything was going to fit, I grabbed the shop vac yet again and cleaned up all the foam bits from when I cut it. I then grabbed some PL glue and began gluing all the foam down. Some of the gaps had to be filled with expanding foam before I could put in the rigid foam. While the glue dried, I clamped some 2x4s down onto the foam, and when I ran out of clamps, I grabbed whatever I could find around the barn to add some weight. Now I had this idea that I could clad the backside of the door in skid wood, so I began the process of tearing apart this old skid. Fun fact, this skid is actually what the sheet metal on the outside of the bus came on. By the time I got the skid all pulled apart and cut down, a lot of the expanding foam was dry enough to cut, so I began to clean up the excess. So I started to lay these boards into place, and while I did love the look of this, I decided to not go this route. So because the door was already more or less 2 inches thick, I didn't want to add any more thickness than I already had. So even though I didn't end up using it on the door, I did keep the wood to be used on the interior of the bus for later. Now I was basically as far as I could go on the backside of the door before adding cladding, so I, with some help, flipped the door over and continued working on the front side. I once again shop vac, followed by yet another pass with the sander, and then wiped everything down with a damp cloth. Once everything was relatively clean, I masked off the windows. I then used self-etching primer in black to cover all the bare metal. The idea was to use this paint so that I would be able to see any pockmarks or scratches that would need repair. But you'll see that in another video. For now, I'm going to end things here. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, I'd ask you to consider liking and subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but I do appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, enjoy your day, and I'll see you next time.